Hello, everyone. This is Deborah Richardson, and today I am putting the AP in Happy, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. This podcast will give a voice to accounts payable team members by talking about the growing reality of cyber attacks in their world and which vendor setup and vendor management techniques they can apply to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Visit the Vendor Process Training Center to enroll in your choice of 55 plus training sessions that will help you and your team avoid fraud, compliance fines, and bad vendor data. Or just sign up to get access to vendor process FAQs and to attend weekly drop-in live Q&A sessions. Visit training.deborahrrichardson.com today. The link will be in the show notes. Have you ever thought about outsourcing your vendor payments? Do you want to know what is involved and what you need to look for? Get educated with Mark Penserini from Corpay about what third-party payment solution providers can do for your payment process. Then find out what else they can do that I agree with but may have you sweating initially. Keep listening. Welcome to episode 219, Mark Penserini on outsourcing your vendor payments, and another outsourcing that I agree with. Do you? So I have a conversation with Mark Penserini from Corpay, and it was right after a November in-person accounts payable conference, and he was on a panel that talked about the future of AP, and he made one statement that I just wanted to get him on the podcast. And I think being on the episode that is the first episode of 2023 really is appropriate because it really sets the stage for what is, I believe, the future of AP. So without any more ado, here is my conversation with Mark. Welcome, everyone. I have a treat today. At least I know a treat for me. I have Mark Penserini here, and recently we were both at the same in-person accounts payable conference. We were recently at the IOFM AP2P Fall Conference, and Mark was on a panel and I was watching in the audience, and he said something that had me trying to dive on him when he came off of the stage. And not only was I successful at doing that, but I was successful in bringing him to the podcast so he can discuss that very bold, but I think a very great statement. So can't wait for this conversation. But before we get to that, welcome, Mark. And why don't you do a brief intro of yourself and the company that you represent, and we can go from there.
Hi, Deborah. Yeah, it was good. It was fun. It was good to see you at the conference and talk to you. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming up and chatting with me afterwards and putting this together. It's fun. It's always fun to talk about this stuff. I've been in the payment automation space for about 8 years now. My degree's in accounting. Yes, I worked in AP departments and accounting departments early on in my life. I worked for a CPA firm for many, many years doing audits and that kind of stuff. So if you saw me, you'd know I'm an old dude. So I've had a long career, which has been a fun career. But this last 8 years talking about payments has been a blast. And just to see how things have moved and shifted, particularly over the last couple of years, because the pandemic, I think, really magnified and kind of stirred a lot of this up. That's I think is what has made it even much more interesting going into 2023 and beyond. I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah, and I have a question. So, could you tell when you were coming off the stage? I know there were like a lot of lights, but could you tell I was like making that beeline to you, and hopefully it didn't scare you, but I think I was like almost running.
Well, I saw you coming, and so but I wasn't worried about it.
Okay.
I honestly, it's been so much fun to go back to these conferences and just be able to talk to people. I love being in the booths and having people come up and ask questions and just chat with me and I love doing the panels and just having an opportunity to really hear what kind of questions people and companies have when they're trying to figure some of this stuff out. And I spent a lot of years in the consulting space, about 20 years. So I look at a lot of this not so much from the company that I work for, which is Corpay, which we do payment automation, but I do really look at this more from a consultative perspective and what's best for that customer. And one size doesn't fit all, and our product doesn't necessarily mean it's gonna be perfect for you or work for you. If that was the case, there wouldn't be anybody else out there. I mean, there are a lot of other companies out there, right? But I
Right.
think understanding the underlying basics and what you're trying to achieve is what's important to me. And then you make your educated decision
Yeah.
on how you want to move forward. But I always just want to be one of those people that's going to give you, at least from my perspective, my experience and the best information I can.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And hoping to get right that information out on this podcast, at least to kind of educate the listeners on the payment solutions that are out there, how it could benefit them, and then how it could do that one thing that I wanted to talk to you about. So let's
Yeah.
go ahead and get started with that, and just start off with talking about outsourcing vendor payments. So I know when I was a practitioner, I actually went to the IOFM AP to P conference, and I forgot what year that was, but I tried to give away like all my payments to somebody because it was a manual process. I had a whole payments team, and the payments themselves was just, it was just very manual. And so let's kind of start off with outsourcing vendor payments. So for those that still have like 100% of their payments in-house, how does the process work, and what are the advantages of outsourcing, right, the vendor payments to a third-party payment solution provider like Corpay?
Yeah, in the simplest terms, what you're trying to do, at least from my opinion, is when you push that button to generate your payment run, and you've got to go in now and create all these checks, and you've got to get them off the printer, and you've got to get them signed, and maybe you got to have co-signatures, and then you've got to
Yeah.
track people down, and then finally you fold it, you stuff it, you put a stamp on it, and you get it in the mail, and then you cross your fingers that the U.S. Postal Service doesn't lose it, particularly this time of year, right?
Yeah.
So and then you got to wait for all that to happen so you can reconcile your bank account. And then, by the way, depending on what happens with that payment, the vendors probably may need to call you because it didn't show up, or the dog ate it, or whatever it happens to be, or my granddaughter colored all over it. Now I can't cash it. I mean, there's just all kinds of stuff that happens. But
Wow.
I
It
think,
sounds like you've heard them all.
well, pretty much. I mean, it's one of those deals. So the goal here is that instead of pushing that button and having that check run or that payment run go to a printer, it's all going to come to a company like Corpay, which that's our whole business. I mean, that's all we do, right? Is this payment automation piece, and we've been very focused on that. And I think that's an important piece, right? Because there's a lot that happens before, right? So there's procure to pay, and there's invoice to pay, and there's all this other stuff to pay. Well, we just want to be the to pay piece, right? Let's just make
Got
it simple. That's all we're doing, which I think, if you're going to outsource that, you can do that at any time without impacting any of the stuff that happens before. And so it makes it pretty simple, I think, to buy back a lot of your AP staff's time by just releasing that to someone like Corpay to be able to just take all those payments and then make them on your behalf to all the vendors that need to be paid timely and efficiently and securely. And then you don't have to deal with that, right? So your reconciliation time goes down. My recommendation again from a consulting perspective is whoever you're giving this to, make sure that they're going to own all of the vendor support, right? So if that vendor does have a question, or the granddaughter did color all over the check, or whatever it happens to be, they don't come back to you to say, hey, can you stop payment? And hey, can you reissue? Or hey, I didn't get the check, or the check's for the wrong amount. Let all that go to the payment service provider, the payment automation provider, and you're going to buy back a ton of time, just that alone, and just releasing all of that and giving that away. And that's really what we saw happen during the pandemic, first of all, because all of a sudden these AP teams were dispersed, and they didn't have the luxury of all being in the same room. And so somebody could generate the checks and somebody could take them off the printer and then go find somebody to sign them. All of a sudden there wasn't anybody. They're all sitting at home. So it really kind of shined a light on the fact that, oh wow, this manual process is kind of outdated. And really, I mean, I look at my daughters, they don't have checks. I mean, my kids don't even know what a check is, I mean, it's just like we're still writing checks, which is crazy to me in today's world, but we do. And so you're just trying to find ways to buy back a lot of that time. And I think that's the simplest solution, is if you can outsource that to somebody that you feel comfortable with and that you feel like you can trust to make those payments on your behalf, I think you're going to save just a ton of time right there alone.
That so resonates with me. So a couple of things. One is you talked about no one writes checks anymore. And it's so funny because even with like the ACH payments, when you're onboarding a vendor, lots of folks, accounts payable teams, vendor teams are still asking for that voided check. And if you get a younger company, they're like, we don't have any checks. Checks.
Yeah.
So that's there.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, I think the other thing is, if you're just doing that today, now all of a sudden you outsource this to someone that's their focus, right? It's all about the payment automation piece. You've now expanded the multiple payment methods that you can offer to a vendor, right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, you've got to do it yourself. And that goes back to, is that really something that your AP staff is set up for, that your company's even set up for, is to start owning all these various digital or electronic payment methods, and then what all goes into that, right? And then how do I support that? Now I got multiple flows of money going out, and I got to deal with that. So it just changes the dynamics when you're still doing your same payment run and you're still pushing the button. Yeah. The difference is you just don't have to go get them off the check printer, or you don't have to deal with all that.
Yeah. And speaking of that check printer, one of the reasons why I was trying to give all my payments away to someone, anybody, and just one of the many reasons, but it was a big reason because I did with that check run, we kept having issues. Either someone would put the checks in the printer upside down. I am not making that up. And
no,
then,
I know you're not.
I went down to the check room one day and they had a picture of Bob Marley on it. And I was like, why do you have a picture of Bob Marley on this big printer that we paid all this money for? And they said, because it be jamming. I thought, oh, here we go. So yes, I was running to anyone. So it sounds like the conversion, which a lot of accounts payable vendor teams, right, tried to do, and the pandemic, right, really accelerated that. The conversion from check payment to ACH payment or any other kind of payment, that the third-party payment solution providers like Corpay, really that's where you live. So is that true? It's for check payments and also any type of electronic payments too. We can give you all of that.
You can give it all. And the beauty is, again, another thing that I would say or recommend if you're looking at solutions is it a single flow, right? Is it a single workflow? So ours is. So you can make all your payments in one single payment run, right? So you don't have to tell us, hey, this vendor needs to be paid this way, or this vendor, or this is an international payment even, right? The way we're set up today is you just do your run. Pick your invoices, pick your vendors, go in and say pay them, hit the button and let it flow, and then we'll take it from there. So, we're going to maximize and optimize those payments to those vendors because we have the relationship with the vendors, right? So they're going to tell us what's the preferred method, right? If they want to be paid by virtual card, which again, a virtual card is just a credit card number without the plastic. That's all it is. But if they want to be paid by card, which a lot of businesses are doing that because it's the fastest way. It's actually the most secure way. There's less fraud on card payments, virtual card payments, than there is on any other kind of vendor payment out there. ACH, right? Same thing. Now, obviously, there's more work involved, and we can talk about that. But whatever method that vendor wants to be paid, and some of them still want to be paid by check. I mean, that's just the reality of it. I'd say probably 30 to 35% of the payments we make to vendors today are still made by check, which
Wow.
amazes me. But we'll do all of that within the same check run. So again, the AP team and the staff on the other side, they're not having to deal with all that. They don't have to try and figure all that out, and they don't have to coordinate with the vendor. Hey, this is how you're going to get paid, or the vendor. And a lot of this we saw shift too during the pandemic is the vendors were being much more proactive, saying, I don't want to be paid by check. I want to be paid by ACH, or I want to be paid by virtual card because I don't want my staff to have to go get the check and deposit it and wait for it. So it's on the other side too, right? And there's cost involved. There's just a lot of cost involved on both sides. So we saw, I think, a real shift also in that the vendors were taking a much more proactive stance on how they wanted to receive their money, as opposed to being dictated by what the customer wanted to do.
Yeah. And, important to remember too is that the vendors had the same problems that the AP teams and vendor teams had. They couldn't, get into their office either, or they had to assign or determine, or what's the right word? They had to, make their AR folks, right, essential employees so that they would have to go into the office. And they were missing things too because they weren't getting delivered. And so I think now, because or as a result of the pandemic, more vendors are open to card payments. So it's a great time to do that conversion, not necessarily from check to ACH, but from check to card payment, because you might be surprised more vendors will be open to that. And I also like what you said about, sending one pay file to the payment solution provider, because today, and when I was looking to transfer my payment cycles, we had 125 per week. Now that's a lot, but that's a lot of pay cycles because we had it in each region. We had to do a pay cycle for checks, a pay cycle for ACH, a pay cycle for wire. But typical vendor or AP payment teams, right, they'll have a separate pay cycle for checks. They probably do it once a week, maybe twice a week. And then they'll have separate pay cycles for ACH and maybe for wire, or maybe if it's an international payment, they've got to go and log in, right, to some other system in order to make that cross-border or non-US payment. So do most third-party payment solutions handle both US and non-US payments?
No, I think it's a little more unique. Again, we started this with our sister company, Cambridge, who is part of the Corpay family, probably around 6 years ago. And so we built an integration directly into Cambridge to do this, because we saw what AP departments had to go through, calling the bank, and it's very expensive, right? I mean, sending an international wire is not cheap. So we looked at all of that, and so it was funny because FleetCor, our parent company, who bought both Cambridge and InvoicePay, was great because we were already integrated with them and already had this relationship to be able to pass them that international payment data directly out of the same payment run. So it's just made it a lot easier for us. So I wouldn't say. I honestly don't know how common it is, but I wouldn't say it's totally common. I think there's a lot of companies that are just domestic based and don't have a fully integrated global payment solution built in.
Okay. But it sounds like Corpay does.
Yeah.
All right. So for those third-party payment solution providers like Corpay that handle both US and non-US payment, when you get the pay file, you are handling the vendor enablement. What payment method will they take? Because you want to get the best payment mix for clients. So you are already interacting with the vendors in that highest risk area, especially if you're paying by ACH or wire, because now you've got to collect and verify the banking details. And so this is where we get into the statement that you made that had me running that beeline to you as you were exiting the stage. You indicated that you thought the future of AP, as far as removing risk, was to outsource your vendor remittance onboarding and changes, right? So don't even collect the vendor banking details in accounts payable or with the vendor team. Let the third party payment solution provider handle it. And I loved that. So can you talk more about um, that philosophy and method that I want to just wallpaper my whole, office with?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm very honest, and I really truly believe that. I don't feel that an AP department's job is to gather vendor banking information, store, manage, and somehow make sure that you keep that vendor banking information secure, right? I mean, that's just not what they were built to do. And it's funny, I tell people this. Do you watch HGTV at all? Do you watch all these DIY shows and all that
I
kind of
do.
stuff?
I do.
I am fascinated with one called It's Help with an exclamation point. I wrecked my house. And these are people who bought a house, moved into it, and then decided they were going to do the remodel themselves, right? So they watch all these shows, and then they start tearing walls out, and then they start tearing electrical out, and then they go, "Oh, I'm not sure I can do this," right? So there's a woman on there. Her name's Jasmine Roth, and
Mhm.
she's made her whole living off of this, right? So people get into this, and then they go, "Oh, this is not good. This is not really what we can do." So then they call her in. Well, then obviously she comes in and she looks at it and goes, "Good thing you didn't knock that wall down because the whole house would have fallen because that's a load-bearing wall." It's that kind of stuff. And so eventually she makes the house look beautiful, and it's shocking how gorgeous it is. And the people go, "I couldn't have even thought of this myself." Well, it's kind of the same idea, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this whole AP department is kind of DIYing ACH enrollments and vendor enablement, and they're taking on all this added responsibility of now gathering vendors' banking information, putting it somewhere, and then trying to keep it secure, and then using it when they need to make a payment to that vendor. And it just kind of makes my stomach get a little wheezy, because I just don't feel like that's what they were there for. And, going back to my history, when I was at the auditors, my role was to lead audit teams that went into companies and dealt with fraud.
Mhm.
But the fraud was internal fraud. 90% of the time, it was somebody on the staff. Not that they started out thinking they were going to steal, but it just became easily available, right?
Right.
Well, what's going to happen here, right? Now you have staff, and who knows who all has visibility into all this banking information. And it's like, why do you want to expose your staff and your internal teams to other people's account? Would you want to? I mean, I wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's just one of those things that, again, I look at what we do and the processes we go through to securely gather that information, the KYC process, the
Mhm.
verification process. It's a painful process. It takes 10 to
Yeah.
15 business days for us to enroll a vendor in an ACH, and all the verification steps that we go through to get that vendor up and running, to one, make sure they're real, that they're a
Yes.
US entity, that bank account's real, that it belongs to them. I mean, all that goes into that is just, it's a lot of work. And I just look at AP departments and go, I just I think it's risky. I mean, it's just my opinion, but to me it's just risky.
I actually share that. It resonates with me because typically, when I was just to back up a bit, when I was a practitioner, my last role, I had, a team of 17, and we were processing, right, 2,000 vendor requests per month. And
Wow.
at the time, when we first started off, my vendor team, right, because it was AP, and historically that has been not the highest level of employee that comes in. So you've got cases still where the beginner level or the entry level coming in doing these AP vendor requests. I was successful, by the way, in getting them upgraded because, we were still processing these requests that was coming through risky email. And that is not an entry level position. But I agree with you, right, that you've got that risk there. And I know that there are going to be some listeners out there that probably have, a smaller team, or maybe it's just them. And they're like, hey, I can do this. I can handle it. I've got the risk at hand. I can tell, right, when those risky emails come in, and I can avoid all the fraud. But, these fraudsters they're evolving, and they're getting smarter. And you're not just looking for that spoofed email because of all of the phishing that has taken place, in the last couple of years that have been successful. They're actually in your vendor's email. So that eagle eye is not going to help you on that piece. And it's not what do you call that? The language in the emails anymore that you can use to tell, right? Because it's not the grammatical errors, because they've got AI out here, artificial
Right.
intelligence, that can write the emails for them, that have the correct context, that don't
Yep.
have, right, any errors in it. And so I think those accounts payable teams or vendor teams that are still relying on non-secure email to collect vendor supporting documentation for ACHs or wires, those banking details, I just think it's very risky. And then you have to keep it in your accounting system or ERP that's then available for, internal fraud. So you have the threat of external fraud in email, and then you have the banking details available for internal occupational fraud perpetrators, right? So I think that's a huge risk to leave in a department that may have, right, those entry level employees, that the once per month or once per year security awareness training is just not enough.
Yeah. Well, and most systems, particularly, I mean, if you're the customer and you've got vendors and you've got your
Yeah,
business, your systems were probably not built and designed for that purpose, right? I mean, it's
yeah,
a different purpose. And I mean, again, we've been doing this for 14 years. Our first customer was an ACH customer. So we
yeah,
learned 14 years ago, and it's continuing to evolve. And like you said, the fraudsters are so much smarter, and I think they got much smarter through the pandemic. I think
yes,
they really took advantage of that. And the amount of fraud that we deal with, or fraud attempts, I should say, not fraud, but
hmm,
fraud attempts that we deal with on a daily basis it's just gone
yeah,
through the roof. It's just crazy. And it's because they have gotten a lot smarter.
yep,
So, you're right. Their emails are not as funky as they used to be. They're very slick. It's maybe, an email address that has one little letter in there that you're not paying attention to,
yeah,
all that kind of stuff, and I just don't see that. It's like, where did the shift come from that's become part of the AP department's job? That's just
yeah,
where I struggle, right? Because these poor AP people, I mean, there's so many other things they could be working on, and yet now they're trying to figure out, and what's it costing that company to manage all
yep,
this? And now you've got to change all your security protocols, and
yep,
you've got to make sure, if fraud does happen, how do you communicate all that out? And
yeah,
and it's a lot of work. ACH payments are the most expensive payments that we make.
yeah,
And that's just not going to change because of the amount of security protocols around getting that vendor enrolled and the process of just making those payments. There's just a lot more risk. And so who's taking on the fraud risk? Well, if you're doing this internally, you're taking on the fraud risk.
yes,
If you're not, if you're going to let a payment automation solution like Corpay do that, again, it's another question I would want to ask if I was looking for a solution is who's going to own the fraud risk, right? Where does that land? Because if I'm sending you a payment file, but I'm not sending you the vendor data, the banking information, you're doing that. You're doing all of the due diligence on that, then the customer shouldn't have to take on that fraud risk, and they don't with Corpay. It's a shift in mindset that you know what, this is not where our expertise lies. Why are we trying to do this in-house when we just really probably shouldn't be doing that? I will say we do have some customers, and our product will handle this, right? If you came to us and said, listen, I got this ACH thing locked and loaded, right? I've got a certain amount of my vendors, they're on ACH, we're not changing, they're not changing, but we do want to outsource our payments. Well, then fine, you can do that. You got to manage 2 payment runs now, right? You still got to manage an ACH payment run in-house or internally, and then you got to manage the rest of it. Well, we can do that. Well, that's fine. I mean, if that's what you want to do. I will tell you, we had a customer that I just spoke to. Well, it's probably been 6-8 weeks ago now, where they have a piece of this that they kept internal, and she said, "Well, we finally got hit." I go, "What do you mean?" "Yep, we got hit by fraud." I go, "Oh boy." And they thought they had this thing locked and loaded, and they do. I mean, they're bigger. They have a lot of IT staff, and they have a lot of security stuff around, and yet they still got hit with a pretty decent chunk. And it's just like, it happens.
Yeah, and I am not surprised about that at all. I do vendor process redesigns, right? When a vendor team is still doing all that by email to add in those authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices, right? Until they can get to some type of automation so they don't have to handle it in-house. And there were 2 different press releases over the summer, and I had 3 different clients over the summer as well that got hit even after they did that confirmation phone call, right? So if there are listeners out there and you're going, hey, I don't need all of this because I had that confirmation call being done, unless you personally, as a listener, I'm talking to you, unless you personally are doing that confirmation call each time and it is a valid call, meaning you're not using the information on the email, you are calling the right person, you're not giving away the new banking, you're authenticating, you might want to rethink your process, because I will tell you, of those 2 press releases and the 3 clients I had that did those confirmation calls, the humanness has really gotten into it. So we've got other people doing it. They know that they need to go into the vendor master file to, get the communication or the contact information, but it's not there. And then they go on the website to get it, and they don't, the vendor doesn't have a website presence. And so they use the next best thing, which is the information from the email, because, right, they haven't necessarily been trained on it, on what to do, when that happens. Maybe they tried to ask somebody, didn't get back to them. It's busy. It's, year end. And so, thinking you have it locked and loaded with that confirmation call is just not, what do you call that, foolproof as you may think it is, right? And so with that, again, I like the idea of outsourcing that risk.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think there are companies like ours that this is our business, just like Jasmine in remodeling houses, right? That's her business. It's every time I watch that show, that cracks me up, man. It's just like these people start tearing walls down. It's like, really? Yeah. But it's the same thing, right? You start this process of gathering all this banking information, and then you got to figure out, how do I store this? Who gets to see it? And then, how do I make sure it's secure and doesn't get stolen, both internally and externally? And it's a lot of work. And people go, oh, it's going to take so much of my IT time to move to some kind of payment automation. Well, I don't believe that's the case either. I mean, ours is very simple, very, very little IT time involved, because we can take what your payment run looks like and we can convert it pretty simply into a payment file that we can read in order to make the payment to your vendors. It's not heavy. The main thing is I would offload that banking information, all that vendor data, and as soon as you get that set up with whoever your payment automation solution is, Get that stuff out of your system.
Yeah.
I would
I
not keep that anywhere.
I completely agree. And then once the payment solution provider has that information, then they are handling any updates. It's not coming to the vendor
That's right.
team or AP team's email, right? You don't have to be that eagle eye to find things. So I really like
Yeah.
that. For the listeners out there that, right, they've got their processes in place and they're going, okay, but what validations and controls, if I opt for this, what validations and controls do the third party payment solution providers have in place to avoid fraud, compliance fines? Because remember now, it's not just fraud. I mean, that's a big piece of it too. But we also want to see if we can get those validations in there to make sure a vendor is real, to make sure the IRS 10 match, the legal name, tax ID, that combination is valid. And just to verify there's no, overall bad vendor data being added. So what validations and controls should third-party payment solution providers have in place that would make that listener say, okay, they're doing what I do.
Yeah. So, part of this is kind of our secret sauce, right?
Yeah.
In the security protocols we go through. So I think, if you were to ask us, we would want to sit down with you and go through that in great detail, but you'd have to sign an NDA. But the
Uh,
reality is that, I mean, the process that we go through today isn't the same process that we even used 6 months ago, because you
mm,
have to continue to shift with what's happening in the fraudsters world, right? How are they
yeah.
coming at you? So we constantly are changing our security protocols for a number of reasons. One, to throw the fraudsters off, and to
Yeah.
make it even more difficult for a vendor, for a fake vendor to come in and just automatically change something. But the basics are there. I mean, KYC,
Mhm.
know your customer. I mean, anytime you're moving money, you got to go through that. You've got to make sure that that customer is valid. The other thing we do is we want to make sure that that vendor is valid to that customer. So we do some verifications along that line too, right? Because
Ah,
a vendor could come in and say, hey, I'm associated to this customer, so I'd like to get set up. Well, you can't just do that in our system.
mm,
There's a secure process you have to go through to actually be a real vendor for that customer. And then, like you said, the banking information obviously is key to this whole thing, validating that and ensuring that is linked directly back to that vendor. So we ask for, a bank letter. We ask for, a check if they have it, or whatever
yeah.
we can get. We're going to validate that, and we're going to do a test to make sure that that belongs to that vendor. So there's a lot that goes into this,
Mhm.
and we've broken this into multiple parts. So we have three different eyes are looking at this through the security protocol
Yeah.
process that we have in place. And I think, again, that's why, people go, wow, that takes so long to get an ACH vendor set up. And I go, I understand, 10 to 15 business days is not short, but after that, you can rest assured that your vendor is going to get paid securely, on time, in the proper, bank account. And if there is an issue, we're going to take that on, right? That's where the fraud risk comes in. So you got to look at that and go, okay, I get it. It's a little painful at first, but the payoff
Yeah.
in the long run is, I don't have to deal with this anymore. This isn't my
Okay.
problem. If the vendor emails you or calls and says, hey, we're changing bank accounts, or hey, whatever it happens to be, great, call Corpay. They'll be
Yeah.
happy to go through the same verification process, because if you change bank accounts, we don't have to start completely over, but
Yeah.
almost, because we're going to go through everything again to make sure that that's all valid before we ever change a bank account.
So I like that. What it sounds like is the client is still going to have their vendor core information like in their accounting system or ERP, and they can do, whatever validations that might be unique to their company or other
Mhm.
compliance validations. The key is though is that the remittance information is not going to be stored in
That's
the
correct.
accounting system or ERP. That risk and that vendor enablement process is going to transfer over to the third party provider provider who's going to try, right, to enhance that payment mix that it's so that it's brings more value to the client. Like try for that card. If you can't do the card, then try for ACH. And in that ACH process, you're going to take the risk and do the, change of banking so that that risk is just shifted from the client. I think that is totally valuable. And I think that is definitely, as you set up on that stage, the future of AP vendor onboarding.
I think another thing is if you're looking for someone to do this payments outsourcing or payment automation, and you're going to ask them to take on the vendor enablement process, another question I would ask is who's doing the vendor campaign? Who's doing the vendor enablement, right?
Yeah.
Corpay does not outsource any of that. So it's all done with our own people in-house.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of third parties that will just do the campaign piece. I'm not a huge fan of that either. I don't, I don't, I don't know if I have real bad feelings about it, but I just like the fact that we keep everything within our own systems and our own people. And we're not outsourcing that again to another third party because, this has been part of our business, right? This has been what we've been doing for 14 years. But it's a good question for you to understand, or for the customer, your listeners to understand. If you're going to look at this and you want to find a payment automation solution, that's another question I would ask is who's actually doing your campaigning? I think it's important to understand that.
All right. So to wrap this up, then, yes, I do agree with you in that outsourcing the vendor enrollment for remittance is definitely the future. What advice would you give to listeners that are thinking about doing that? I know you already kind of talked about asking who's doing the campaign, what the campaign looks like, what vendors, fit ACH versus virtual card. What other advice would you give to those that are looking at or thinking about outsourcing their payments and the related vendor onboarding?
Well, I think anybody that wants to do this, you've got to do your due diligence. I think first of all, making sure you have a really good understanding of what your flow is internally today, so you can start to compare. Okay, what is it going to look like if I move this or shift this to a payment automation solution, a third party? How does that change how we work? And then what information do I still have access to, right? So what am I going to be able to see after I send you this payment run, or how does that information get back into my system? Do I have access to that vendor information? Or what do I have access to? I think all of those are good questions to ask. To your point, what does the vendor campaign look like? What are you saying, right? I would want to know that because these are my vendors. If I'm the listener, I'm the customer. I've built a relationship with this vendor. I don't want to mess it up. So I want to know, what does that script look like? And what are you saying to these vendors? One of the things we always recommend with a new customer as we go through the implementation process is, we ask them to reach out to the vendor ahead of time and say, hey, we're using Corpay to make our payments. We want to move to a digital payment, right? We want to get off checks. We want to reduce our fraud risk. And in fact, we're reducing you as a vendor fraud risk because of it. So Corpay is going to reach out, right? So let them know ahead of time that this is happening. And, we all want to work together with that. But I think understanding what that communication looks like, how often does this campaign stuff happen? What are the thresholds for these campaigns? There's a lot that goes into that.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not going to call a vendor that, you pay once a year, $500, right? I mean, we're just going to send them a check because that's a lot of work for one payment. So, there's thresholds. So I think working together with whoever's going to be your payment automation solution provider is important, that you really dig into this and understand how all of that works. You have a lot more confidence than when you're talking with your vendors. And, ideally, you're going to see your vendor relationships even better because you've got more time to focus on those vendor relationships, and it's not all about the support and, all the vendor data. You're not dealing with all that anymore. So
Yeah.
it should make your life a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think one of the last or best questions they can ask is, does the payment solution provider take on that risk if a fraudulent payment does happen? Yes, I
Absolutely.
love that one. All right. So, Mark, thank you very much for coming on and educating us both in general about what a third party payment solution provider can do and the questions that we need to ask. But also, I do want to just ask if someone is interested in Corpay, where they would go to get more information on the payment services from Corpay.
Well, they can always email me at mark.penserini, which is Penserini at corpay.com. Or you can look up corpay.com and go there, and there's a lot of information that we'll give you out there. But I'm always happy to take questions if somebody emails me or wants to chat. I love talking about this stuff, like I said. So happy to answer any questions you may have. Everybody's unique. Every company's got their own little idiosyncrasies that they got to deal with or work through. And I'm happy to talk about those and hopefully help you, guide you to find the right payment automation solution for your business.
Yes. And I just want to say, if you were like me and you are still doing check payments and you had that picture of Bob Marley on your check printer, you might want to reach out.
That's pretty
All
good.
right. Yeah, Mark, thank you for coming on. Again, I appreciate it. Maybe we'll bring you back in the future to tell us what's trending next year.
2023, here we go.
Yeah, here we go. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
All right, so that was a great conversation, and hopefully you are not sweating. And if you are, I would love to hear why. So feel free to comment wherever you are listening to this podcast or email me at deborah@deborahrrichardson.com, and my email address is in the show notes. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the 219th episode of the Putting the AP in Happy podcast, where accounts payable teams are empowered to protect the vendor master file from fraud. Don't forget to check the show notes for the links mentioned in the podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing and writing a review of my podcast on the platform that you use to listen. Stay happy.